Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The Consensus Question. Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace functions as a sophisticated examination of institutional decay and the inherent fragility of democracy when confronted with the weaponization of bureaucratic indifference. While often simplified as a standard struggle between light and darkness, the film is a precise study of how a sophisticated, high-tech society systematically unravels through the commodification of conflict. The narrative reality is one defined by the friction between the stagnating, ritualized traditions of the Galactic Republic and the agile, predatory nature of corporate expansionism. The Trade Federation, functioning as a state-sanctioned monopoly, leveraged the scarcity of resources and trade routes to paralyze the political center. By establishing a world where the Senate is a theater of parliamentary procedure designed to mask the reality of corporate warfare, the film portrays a society that has lost the ability to distinguish between diplomacy and market manipulation. The human element of this crisis manifests through the fracturing of identity among its key players. For Anakin Skywalker, the narrative of his origins is not one of a simple hero's journey but an exploration of the trauma inherent in being chosen by an institution that views him as a resource to be harvested rather than a child to be nurtured. His epistemic fracture occurs as he navigates the dissonance between the Jedi Order's rhetoric of selfless service and the reality of their detachment. The Jedi serve as the film's moral and intellectual elite, yet their authority is rooted in a rigid, monastic discipline that blinds them to the shifting currents of the galaxy. Qui-Gon Jinn emerges as a singular, disruptive force, not because he rejects the Order, but because he perceives the living reality of the Force, which exists in defiance of the codified, stagnant dogma maintained by his peers. Visually, the film reinforces this dichotomy between the organic and the synthetic through its architectural and technical choices. Naboo represents a harmonious, gilded ideal of society, yet its elegance is shown to be purely ornamental, incapable of resisting the industrial, standardized mass of the droid army. The production design meticulously maps this divide. The sleek, frictionless aesthetics of Coruscant conceal deep, subterranean layers of social neglect and political cynicism. The reliance on digital environment serves as a visual metaphor for the film's philosophical argument: the world has become a simulation of order. Characters walk through vast, procedurally generated spaces that underscore their collective insignificance against the encroaching shadow of the Sith, who operate in the margins where the Republic's light does not reach. Philosophically, the film engages with the inherent flaw of the Jedi's moral calculus. By attempting to remain neutral mediators in a conflict driven by commerce, they inadvertently facilitate the rise of an authoritarian shadow. The tragedy of the film is not the inevitable outcome of a dark side plot, but the proactive failure of democratic institutions to recognize that an existential threat cannot be resolved through the very legal frameworks the enemy seeks to exploit. The Sith operate as the only true pragmatists in the narrative, understanding that the Republic's attachment to its own institutional ego is the precise mechanism of its destruction. The film posits that when a civilization becomes so enamored with its own history and process, it loses the capacity to perceive the future, even when that future is actively dismantling its present. The technical execution of the film, particularly its reliance on cutting-edge digital compositing and set extensions, mirrors the narrative theme of artificiality. The vibrant, saturated colors and the dense, multi-layered frames create a sensory experience that feels detached from the tactile reality of the original trilogy. This shift in the visual medium is not merely a stylistic choice but a reinforcement of the film's thesis on the loss of grounding. The characters, especially the Jedi, move through these synthetic spaces with a performative grace that masks their internal uncertainty. In the final assessment, the tragedy of the film resides in its depiction of a golden age that is already long dead. The ending offers no catharsis, only a false sense of resolution that provides the perfect cover for the dark forces to consolidate their power. By ending with a celebration of a triumph that is fundamentally hollow, the film forces the viewer to confront the persistence of the cycle. It is a cautionary narrative about the speed at which a civilization can transition from perceived stability to total collapse, suggesting that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who arrives to conquer, but the one who utilizes the existing architecture of the state to orchestrate a long, slow extinction from within. The Phantom Menace is not an external force, but the institutional complacency that allows for the erosion of truth, justice, and agency. The subversion question. Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace is frequently dismissed as a juvenile adventure hindered by excessive exposition and tonal inconsistency. This consensus posits the film as a simplistic precursor to an inevitable tragedy, a mere bridge designed to connect the iconic imagery of the original trilogy to a new generation. Yet, such a reading fails to acknowledge the film's status as a calculated, harrowing autopsy of a decaying institution. The Phantom Menace is not a film about the rise of an empire, it is a clinical study of how a hyper-advanced, bureaucratic society renders itself defenseless by prioritizing economic efficiency over ethical discernment. The film portrays a galaxy that has traded its moral agency for the comfort of procedural stability, creating a vacuum that the darkness naturally expands to fill. The world of the Republic is defined by the commodification of existence. From the taxation of trade routes to the enslavement of sentient beings on Tatooine, every interaction is quantified by its value in a global market. The film's architectural hierarchy reflects this, contrasting the sterile, frictionless marble of Coruscant with the subterranean, rusted-out decay of the Outer Rim. The Jedi, once guardians of cosmic balance, have been integrated into this corporate structure, functioning as glorified diplomatic troubleshooters for a governing body that has forgotten how to lead. By positioning the Jedi as civil servants who arrive via government transport to negotiate disputes between corporate conglomerates and sovereign planets, the film illustrates the complete evaporation of the state. Political authority has been entirely eclipsed by economic influence, leaving the Jedi to act as the legal enforcement for interests they do not fully understand. This structural decay finds its human anchor in the figure of Anakin Skywalker. Conventional readings often view him as a messianic archetype, a chosen child destined for a predetermined path. However, the film presents him as a profound anomaly within the system, a child whose immense potential is immediately recognized not by his spirit, but by his utility. The Jedi's assessment of Anakin is entirely clinical. He is treated as a variable to be balanced, a power source to be harvested, and an asset to be managed. His trauma on Tatooine is not a narrative trope meant to establish his humility, but a foundational experience that the Republic is constitutionally incapable of addressing. The Republic accepts the slave trade as a baseline reality, and in doing so, it proves that its purported high-minded ideals are nothing more than a thin veil for a system that thrives on the exploitation of the vulnerable. The film's philosophical weight rests on its depiction of the phantoms mentioned in the title. These are not merely the Sith, but the unseen consequences of a society that has abandoned the pursuit of truth for the preservation of order. The Jedi believe they are guided by the Force, yet their epistemological framework is heavily mediated by the very political machinery they serve. They have become so entrenched in the discourse of the Republic that they have lost the ability to perceive a threat that does not fit into an official, recorded data stream. The Sith are the only entities in the film who operate with total clarity, precisely because they understand that the Republic's reliance on information-based governance has created a fatal blind spot. The antagonist's logic is a rejection of the Republic's consensus-based reality, making his victory not a product of superior strength, but of an superior grasp on the inherent weakness of a system that refuses to acknowledge the existence of genuine, non-quantifiable malice. The visual craft reinforces this alienation. The extensive use of digital compositing and wide-angle cinematography creates a sense of profound scale, but it is a scale that emphasizes individual insignificance rather than wonder. The characters are frequently framed against massive, synthetic environments that dwarf their movements, suggesting that they are mere cogs within a machine that is far larger than their capacity to influence it. Even the lightsaber duels, often praised for their kinetic precision, are meticulously choreographed to strip away the chaos of struggle. They are cold, technical displays of professional skill, contrasting sharply with the raw, emotional weight that should attend such moments. These technical choices reflect the internal state of a civilization that has refined its form to the point of losing its content. The tragedy of the Phantom Menace is not that the light is extinguished, but that the light had already become a flickering, sterile reflection of a dying system long before the darkness arrived. By the time the film concludes with the celebration of a precarious peace, the audience is left with the uncomfortable realization that the mechanisms of democracy have been fully compromised. The Phantom has effectively occupied the machinery of the state. The film concludes not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet, chilling assurance that the collapse is now inevitable. The final image of the film, a celebration occurring against the backdrop of a system that has just signaled its own obsolescence, serves as a searing indictment of the complacency that precedes all major historical failures. The structure has held, but the society it was meant to protect has already been hollowed out from within, leaving only the illusion of continuity to persist. The anomaly question. The Phantom Menace serves as a profound meditation on the erosion of institutional wisdom, positioning itself as a tragedy of complacency rather than a conventional hero's journey. The film operates on the thesis that the collapse of a democratic state is not the result of sudden external shocks, but a slow, tectonic shifting of moral and political capital towards stagnation. At the center of this dissolution lies the anomaly of the Gungan civilization and its integration into the galactic fold. While critics often dismiss Jar Jar Binks as a jarring tonal shift, his existence is the film's essential engine. He is a representative of a repressed, subterranean culture whose forced inclusion into the hyper-rationalized corridors of Coruscant exposes the utter spiritual bankruptcy of the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic. By introducing an organic, chaotic, and fundamentally unpolished element into the sterile, bureaucratic heart of the galaxy, the film forces the viewer to confront the rot hidden within the Order's own rigid definitions of enlightenment. The Republic depicted here is a society suffocating under its own weight, governed by economic abstraction rather than human or communal need. The conflict is initiated not by a grand ideological clash, but by a trade dispute, grounding the stakes in the mundane mechanics of commerce. Architecture functions as the primary visual indicator of this societal stratification. The opulent, sprawling cityscape of Coruscant, with its gleaming spires and frictionless transit, stands as a testament to the centralization of power. In contrast, the Gungan city of Otoh Gunga, submerged beneath the waters of Naboo, represents the literal and figurative marginalization of those who operate outside the Republic's economic sphere. The film posits that the Jedi have become architects of this sterile reality, effectively trading their role as guardians of peace for the role of enforcers of administrative order. Their movement through space is methodical and detached, reflecting an epistemology that values consensus and procedure over empathy or intuition. Central to this psychological landscape is the trauma of Anakin Skywalker. His narrative is not merely one of potential, but of a boy trapped within a system of commodification, a slave whose value is strictly measured by his technical utility. The film avoids a simplistic arc of triumph, instead showing how the Jedi's rigid, detached philosophy effectively blinds them to the burgeoning darkness within him. They treat him as an anomaly to be processed rather than a human child requiring guidance. This failure represents the core wound of the Jedi, a reliance on a cold, intellectualized version of the Force that has rendered them incapable of connecting with the visceral realities of love, fear, and human attachment. Their refusal to acknowledge the boy's pain, coupled with their insistence on cold detachment, creates the very void that Chancellor Palpatine eventually fills. The film's visual language reinforces this sense of detachment. The extensive use of CGI and digital set extensions creates a world that feels synthetic, intentionally mirroring the artificiality of the Republic's governance. This is not a failure of technique, but a purposeful aesthetic choice that emphasizes how far these characters have drifted from the organic, tangible world. The Jedi occupy a space that is clean, bright, and ultimately empty, while the threats to their order emerge from the shadows of the trade routes and the depths of the swamps, places that the official narrative of the Republic has deemed insignificant. The lightsaber battles, often cited for their technical precision, are actually displays of trapped energy. The characters move with a robotic grace that highlights their separation from the natural world. The philosophical underpinnings of the film lean into the inevitability of change. The Republic is a structure in its twilight, where the illusion of order is maintained through a complex web of protocol and propaganda. Even the Jedi, who should serve as the conscience of this society, have become instruments of the state, unable to perceive the truth even as it stands before them in the form of a masked Sith Lord. The film argues that the collapse of such a system is not only expected but necessary. The decay is the catalyst for a radical, if painful, evolution. By the time the film reaches its conclusion, the celebratory parade on Naboo acts as a final, ironic mask over a festering reality. The tragedy is that the characters remain largely unaware of the impending doom, suggesting that the most dangerous form of ignorance is the comfort found within an institutionalized, failing narrative. The legacy of the Phantom Menace lies in this unflinching look at the moment the lights began to flicker, proving that the most profound shifts in history occur not with a bang, but with the quiet, bureaucratic approval of one's own obsolescence. The synthesis question. The Phantom Menace serves as a meticulous study of institutional atrophy, illustrating how a civilization, when granted absolute peace, becomes a vessel for its own controlled demolition. While the surface narrative depicts a grand struggle between the forces of order and chaos, the film functions as a diagnostic critique of a society that has surrendered its critical faculties to the comfort of bureaucratic consensus. The central irony of the film is that the Jedi Council, the purported guardians of justice, act as the primary architects of the Republic's decline by prioritizing the preservation of tradition over the recognition of an evolving, existential threat. The world-building of the film reflects this internal decay. The Republic operates as a rigid, top-down hierarchy where information is filtered through a prism of diplomatic immunity and procedural inertia. The architectural geography, particularly the Senate chambers and the Jedi Temple, emphasizes a frictionless, sterile environment that effectively isolates its inhabitants from the messy realities of the Outer Rim. By placing the centers of power in high-altitude, pristine structures, the film creates a visual divide between the enlightened elite and the scavenged, labor-dependent periphery of Tatooine. This physical distance is a mirror for the moral distance of the characters. The Jedi possess the power to intervene in the suffering of the enslaved, yet they view the plight of the individual through the lens of political neutrality. Their adherence to the status quo is not a lack of morality, but an excess of institutional dogma that renders them blind to the shifting tides of history. This epistemic failure finds its most jarring expression in the character of Anakin Skywalker. He is introduced as a literal commodity, a slave on a peripheral world, yet he becomes the fulcrum upon which the entire galactic power structure pivots. His existence serves as the film's central anomaly. The Jedi believe in the deterministic prophecy of the Chosen One, using this metanarrative to justify their interference in his life, while simultaneously refusing to address the trauma inherent in his upbringing. Their failure to liberate him from his past, effectively choosing to train a child in a restrictive, celibate, and detached order, guarantees his eventual fracture. The film portrays the Jedi's rigid philosophy not as a path to salvation, but as an ideological engine that manufactures the very monster it intends to prevent. The technical execution of the film reinforces this sense of systemic isolation. The heavy reliance on digital set extensions and synthetic environments works to create an uncanny atmosphere, one where the characters exist in a world that feels increasingly hollow and artificial. This is not a failure of craft but a deliberate aesthetic choice. The characters are frequently framed against massive, indifferent CG backdrops that dwarf them, visually communicating their insignificance within a machine that has grown too vast to govern. The use of sterile, brightly lit interiors contrasts sharply with the gritty, tactile reality of the film's combat sequences. When the conflict finally moves into the physical realm, specifically the kinetic, desperate violence of the final lightsaber duel, the film strips away the bureaucratic noise, revealing that the Republic's grand order is ultimately maintained only by the edge of a blade. Ultimately, the film posits that societal collapse is an inevitable byproduct of a civilization that has commodified its own survival. The Republic's reliance on the Jedi as a monolithic, untouchable authority figure creates a feedback loop where the state ceases to be responsible for its own protection or ethics. The final scene, characterized by a hollow celebration and a veneer of peace, provides no true catharsis. Instead, it serves as a chilling testament to the power of state-sanctioned ignorance. By failing to acknowledge the true nature of the threat, the characters solidify their trajectory toward destruction. The Phantom Menace is a haunting document of how a culture's dedication to an idealized past renders it entirely defenseless against the machinery of its own future. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. The Phantom Menace functions as a sophisticated examination of systemic fragility within a galaxy governed by the illusion of bureaucratic stability. At its core, the film argues that the Galactic Republic is a hollowed-out corporate entity where political agency has been entirely eclipsed by the unchecked flow of capital and the commodification of trade routes. The narrative establishes that the fundamental currency of this reality is movement itself. Whoever controls the lanes of travel controls the flow of information, resources, and influence. This monopoly is visualized through the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo, a blunt, material application of economic force that exposes the feebleness of the Senate's legislative reach. By isolating a planet from the essential arteries of commerce, the film demonstrates that peace in this universe is merely a thin, temporary overlay on a structure designed to prioritize efficient extraction over civic duty. Within this stratified reality, the black market serves as a revealing diagnostic tool for what the society deems expendable. On the desert world of Tatooine, the shadow economy flourishes in the absence of central governance, where junk dealers and slavers trade in hardware and sentient lives with equal indifference. The presence of enslaved labor, embodied by Anakin Skywalker, reveals a society that categorizes human potential as a resource to be harvested or auctioned. This stark reality of commodification is juxtaposed against the sterile, gilded chambers of Coruscant, where the Jedi Order and the Senate operate within a bubble of refined detachment. The film highlights a rigid technological gatekeeping, where high-tier, hyper-efficient hardware is exclusively reserved for the elite, while the populace in the outer rims relies on repurposed, scavenged, and often hazardous technology that reinforces their physical entrapment. For the average civilian in this milieu, a normal Tuesday is characterized by the constant threat of predatory commerce. The film illustrates a baseline of systemic vulnerability, where citizens live under the shadow of corporate actors who possess the power to unilaterally sever their access to basic necessities. This pervasive instability renders the arrival of the Jedi and the subsequent political maneuvering not as grand heroics, but as desperate attempts to preserve a crumbling, inequitable status quo. The Republic is a system in late-stage erosion, where the lines between governance and corporate profit have blurred into a single, indifferent mechanism of control. The architectural hierarchy of the film further validates this power imbalance. The opulent, high-altitude architecture of Theed and the towering, endless spires of Coruscant represent a civilization that has physically ascended above the grit of its own resource-dependent reality. These structures are designed to project permanence and grace, serving as visual propaganda that masks the structural decay occurring in the neglected spaces below. Meanwhile, the subterranean and peripheral environments, such as the cluttered, rusted workshops of Mos Espa, serve as the physical manifestations of the galaxy's forgotten, labor-intensive backbone. By contrasting these environments, the film creates a geography of exclusion that emphasizes how far removed the centers of political power are from the realities of those they supposedly protect. This systemic structure acts as the primary driver for the film's inciting events. The characters are not merely reacting to a conflict between light and dark, they are navigating a collapse of the very social contracts that provide safety. The Jedi, once the defenders of a principled order, find themselves struggling to maintain authority in an environment where their moral mandate is constantly challenged by the economic pragmatism of entities like the Trade Federation. As the system collapses inward, the film forces its protagonists to recognize that their influence is limited by the very architecture they serve. The reality of the galaxy is one defined by the friction between those who possess the capital to dictate the terms of existence and those whose lives are treated as the fuel for that ongoing mechanism. Through this lens, the film presents a world where stability is an expensive, manufactured illusion, constantly failing under the weight of its own greed. Architecture and the visual geography. The visual landscape of the Phantom Menace serves as a meticulously calibrated map of a civilization caught between its fading grandeur and the encroaching shadow of institutional decay. The architecture functions as a primary indicator of power, establishing a clear hierarchy that separates the inhabitants of the galactic core from those existing on the periphery. On Coruscant, the verticality of the urban sprawl dictates a rigid social geography. The ruling elite occupy the uppermost spires, environments characterized by polished, frictionless surfaces and an oppressive abundance of sterile, controlled light. This upward reach represents an aspiration toward divine authority, a structural manifestation of the Jedi Council's detachment from the tactile realities of the common citizen. In contrast, the subterranean layers of the planet, and the entirety of Tatooine, are defined by claustrophobic, repurposed, and weathered surfaces. Here, the architecture is not built for comfort or aesthetic expression, but for basic utility and survival. The tension between the synthetic and the organic further reinforces this stratification. As the narrative moves from the refined, high-tech interiors of the Republic's capital to the sun-bleached, desolated landscapes of the Outer Rim, the production design highlights the disparity between worlds that have fully embraced technological totalization and those that remain tethered to primitive, resource-scarce conditions. On Naboo, we see an attempt at equilibrium, where elegant, sprawling structures are designed to harmonize with the natural environment. The architecture is curved and fluid, reflecting a society that still views itself as an extension of its ecosystem. Conversely, the droid armies and the Trade Federation vessels represent the ultimate detachment from nature, utilizing cold, modular, and repetitive geometry. These synthetic constructions are designed to be replaceable, emphasizing a worldview where the individual, or the planet, is merely a resource to be processed or liquidated. The film presents a society that, while appearing to be in its golden age, is already living in the ruins of a previous, more robust era. The infrastructure of Tatooine is a poignant example of this decline. The characters inhabit a world constructed from the detritus of past civilizations. The pods used in the race, the scrap-laden streets of Mos Espa, and the subterranean dwellings all suggest a culture that has lost the ability to innovate and is instead reliant on scavenging the artifacts of the past. This decay is not merely aesthetic, it is the visual evidence of a stagnant system where the capacity for original creation has been supplanted by a desperate, repetitive maintenance of outdated machinery. Navigation through this geography further underscores the disparity in agency. The camera adopts distinct movements for different tiers of the galactic hierarchy. In the elite zones, shots are wide, controlled, and gliding, suggesting a perspective of detached oversight where the individuals are dwarfed by their own constructed environments. The scale of these wide shots, achieved through ambitious digital set extensions, functions as a visual argument for the insignificance of the individual within a sprawling, indifferent bureaucracy. When the narrative shifts to the slums or the desert, the camera becomes more reactive and intimate, forced to negotiate the chaotic, cluttered pathways of the marginalized. By tethering the viewer to these distinct modes of movement, the film physically communicates the gulf between those who influence the course of the Republic and those who are merely moved by its machinery. Ultimately, the production design creates a world that is visually drowning in its own history and scale. The density of the digital environments, from the teeming, multi-layered skylines of Coruscant to the intricate, weathered textures of Tatooine, serves as a testament to a society where the weight of the past and the sheer magnitude of the system have rendered individual action increasingly precarious. The visual geography of the film is not just a backdrop, it is the physical architecture of the very stagnation that the plot seeks to address, positioning the characters within a world that is as magnificent as it is fragile. Epistemology, information, and society. The Phantom Menace functions as a sophisticated study of institutional decay, demonstrating how a galactic society loses its grasp on objective reality through the delegation of truth to bureaucratic and technological intermediaries. The film presents the Republic not as a functional democracy, but as a rigid epistemological structure where information is heavily mediated by procedural protocols and sensory-dampening decorum. Within this society, truth is never a product of empirical observation, it is a consensus established through a labyrinthine propaganda engine. The ruling class maintains order by enforcing a grand narrative of perpetual stability, a mythic history of peaceful coexistence that suppresses the reality of systemic exploitation occurring in the Outer Rim. The film reveals that the Republic's primary failure is its reliance on these formal abstractions to the detriment of actual knowledge, leaving the governing bodies effectively blind to the rising shadow of the Sith until it is physically manifested in their chambers. This disconnect between data and wisdom is central to the film's sociological architecture. The Jedi Council, acting as the ultimate epistemic authority, embodies a paradox of heightened awareness coupled with profound ignorance. They process vast amounts of sensory data through their connection to the Force, yet they remain tethered to an institutional dogma that categorizes information based on its conformity to their established ideology. When Qui-Gon Jinn presents evidence of a new, tangible threat, the Council rejects the observation because it conflicts with their pre-existing metanarrative of the Sith's extinction. Here, the film illustrates a society drowning in noise, where the capacity for deep analysis is sacrificed for the comfort of institutional continuity. The Council's refusal to acknowledge the anomaly of the Sith is an act of ideological self-preservation, demonstrating how systemic gatekeeping functions to protect a comfortable, albeit false, state of reality. The world-building reinforces this theme through the stark visual contrast between the sterile, crystalline halls of Coruscant and the granular, scavenged existence of the Outer Rim. On Coruscant, reality is mediated by the architecture of power, high-altitude, frictionless spaces where the political elite communicate through holographic projections and parliamentary procedure. This is the seat of the propaganda engine, where information is curated to emphasize the cohesion of the state. Conversely, Tatooine exists outside this system of managed truth. It is a space of objective, often harsh, reality where the lack of institutional oversight creates a vacuum filled by illicit markets and slave labor. The film positions these outgroups as the true censors of the universe. It is in the chaotic, unmanaged spaces of the desert that the next stage of history is forged, while the central government remains paralyzed by its own procedural loops. The character arc of Anakin Skywalker serves as the ultimate collision point between this rigid social structure and the raw, untempered reality of the individual. Anakin exists outside the defined metanarrative of the Republic, possessing an unmediated connection to the potential of the future that the Jedi cannot categorize or contain. His transition from slave to initiate is a movement from a life defined by the objective cruelty of scarcity to one governed by the restrictive, abstract philosophies of the Temple. The film tracks this movement as a loss of agency, suggesting that in this society, joining the Order is synonymous with accepting a pre-written identity. The Jedi attempt to refine him through their specific vocabulary of morality, yet Anakin remains a disruptive anomaly. His existence exposes the gaps in the official history, as he is the literal embodiment of a prophecy that the institution cannot explain without fundamentally altering its own foundation. Visually, the film utilizes expansive CGI environments to underscore the insignificance of the individual against the massive, self-correcting mechanisms of the state. The wide shots of the Senate chambers, with their thousands of floating, digitized representatives, emphasize that in such an environment, the singular voice is absorbed into the collective noise. The camera movement, often gliding and detached, reflects the perspective of a governing body that views the galaxy as a map of manageable variables rather than a collection of lived experiences. This sense of detachment is a deliberate technical choice to highlight the failure of the characters to connect with the human costs of their policies. The film's tragedy lies in this failure. The characters are too preoccupied with maintaining the coherence of their institutional reality to see that the system is already dissolving from within. The Phantom Menace provides a profound meditation on the collapse of an era, depicting a society that chooses the comfort of its own myths over the urgent, inconvenient facts of its demise. By prioritizing the stability of their intellectual and political apparatuses, the protectors of the Republic inadvertently facilitate the very threat they claim to prevent. The film suggests that when an organization achieves absolute control over the production of truth, it creates a reality that is fundamentally incapable of responding to genuine crisis. The ultimate legacy of the film is its unflinching depiction of a civilization reaching its tipping point, not through a sudden external strike, but through the slow, systematic erosion of the ability to recognize truth when it appears on the horizon. The struggle depicted is not merely a conflict of light and dark, but a struggle to perceive reality outside the confines of an ossified, failing system. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Star Wars, Episode I, The Phantom Menace functions as a sophisticated examination of institutional decay, mapping the transition from a governing body reliant on consensus to one surrendered to the mechanics of corporate hegemony. The film establishes a universe where the Republic, once a bastion of order, has become an inert bureaucracy paralyzed by proceduralism. This is a world defined by the collapse of public oversight, where the Trade Federation, an entity that manages logistics and transit, possesses the military and political leverage to bypass planetary sovereignty entirely. By situating the film's inciting incident at the intersection of trade disputes and administrative stagnation, the narrative reveals a society where economic interest has fundamentally eclipsed the legislative function of the state. The architecture of this world reinforces these power dynamics through a stark geography of segregation. The opulent, clean, and frictionless chambers of Coruscant represent the detached center of authority, while the marginalized inhabitants of Tatooine exist in a state of resource scarcity and scavenging. In this environment, the Jedi Order acts as a specialized instrument of mediation, yet even they are rendered structurally impotent by the very systems they serve. Their presence as an elite caste provides a veneer of stability, but the film illustrates that their reliance on intuition and ancient tradition leaves them ill-equipped to confront the cold, rationalized aggression of emerging corporate powers. This creates a state of systemic vulnerability, as the Republic turns its gaze inward to debate the nuances of taxation and trade routes. The actual structural integrity of the galaxy erodes, allowing for the quiet, calculated infiltration of an existential shadow. This erosion is accelerated by a fundamental epistemic fracture within the central characters. The protagonists operate under the assumption that the institutional narratives they uphold, peace, justice, and democratic representation remain valid. However, the visual language of the film constantly undermines this faith. Whether through the cold, artificial lighting of the Senate or the sterile, clinical environments of the Naboo Palace, the characters are shown to be navigating a reality that is no longer responsive to their moral codes. The film's focus on the young Anakin Skywalker provides a poignant illustration of this discord. His arrival into the Jedi Order is not merely a transition to a new life, but a forced integration into a flawed, ancient structure that is unknowingly cultivating its own destruction. The Jedi's inability to reconcile Anakin's internal volatility with their rigid dogma highlights a failure of mentorship and pedagogical understanding, signaling that the institution is as much a victim of its own stagnant philosophy as it is of external manipulation. The technical craft of the film serves as a manifestation of this systemic instability. The extensive use of digital compositing and synthetic environments produces a visual aesthetic that feels intentionally detached from the organic, tactile history of the previous era. By populating the screen with massive, sprawling digital vistas and ornate, artificial cityscapes, the production design diminishes the individual, emphasizing the insignificance of the human element against the backdrop of an expanding, technocratic machine. The use of sound and music further cements this atmosphere, shifting between the grand, sweeping expectations of heroism and the unnerving, sterile quietude of spaces where true political machinations occur. These visual and auditory choices work in tandem to create a world that feels increasingly hollowed out, where the mechanisms of power have become so complex and digitized that the moral reality of the citizens has been obscured. At its core, The Phantom Menace is a tragedy of inevitability. The narrative forces a confrontation between the ideal of a functioning, equitable society and the reality of a system collapsing under its own weight. The characters are not merely fighting a villain, but are struggling against the inertia of a crumbling civilization that has lost the capacity for decisive, ethical action. Because the Jedi and the Republic rely on an outdated epistemology, a belief that they can negotiate with entities that operate solely on the logic of exploitation, they are caught in a feedback loop of their own making. Their attempts to preserve the status quo only provide the necessary cover for the system to accelerate its own downfall. The film's conclusion provides no genuine catharsis, but rather a chilling synthesis of the preceding events. The victory on Naboo is presented as a momentary, superficial reprieve that conceals the true shift in power. By focusing on the quiet, lingering threat that persists beyond the final credits, the film argues that the struggle against a decaying system is a continuous, often Sisyphean endeavor. It posits that when an institution reaches a point of absolute administrative capture, the individual's moral agency becomes the only, albeit fragile, barrier against total collapse. Through this lens, the film stands as a testament to the idea that the preservation of values requires more than just adherence to law. It demands an active, vigilant, and frequently lonely confrontation with the forces that seek to render the human experience into a mere commodity. The legacy of the film is found in this sobering realization that the most dangerous threats are not those that break the system from the outside, but those that quietly rewrite the rules from within, ensuring that the collapse is achieved with the full, albeit misguided, participation of the very people tasked with protecting the state. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The Phantom Menace functions as a profound examination of how rigid institutional frameworks fracture the individual psyche, forcing a collapse of the self under the weight of predetermined destinies. At the center of this exploration is the Jedi Order, a collective structure that mandates an epistemic homogeneity, requiring its members to suppress the erratic nature of personal history in favor of a sanitized, detached version of reality. For the Jedi, the truth is an externally imposed equilibrium, maintained through a vocabulary of non-attachment that acts as a linguistic cage. When characters like Qui-Gon Jinn operate within this system, they possess a limited lexicon for processing individual empathy. They are permitted to act in the interest of the will of the Force, yet they lack the conceptual tools to articulate the personal grief or attachment that inevitably arises from their service. The epistemic fracture within the narrative is most pronounced in the arrival of Anakin Skywalker, a figure whose existence defies the Order's carefully curated taxonomy of life. Anakin's presence acts as a catalyst for cognitive dissonance, particularly for the Council, whose reliance on ancient prophecy, their primary metanarrative of history, blinds them to the reality of the child standing before them. The Council's refusal to perceive Anakin as an individual, preferring instead to view him as a variable in a cosmic equation, creates a profound misalignment between his subjective experience of fear and their institutional perception of his readiness. This disconnect represents the fundamental failure of their discourse. They are incapable of hearing his pain because their language dictates that such pain is a precursor to an inevitable moral collapse. Anakin, in turn, constructs a fabricated ego, that of the fated savior, to survive the trauma of his transition from enslaved laborer to institutional ward. This identity serves as a coping mechanism, shielding him from the reality that he has merely traded one form of servitude for another, albeit one cloaked in the aesthetic of light and nobility. The film reveals that trauma is not merely an event but a condition of the environment. The environments of Tatooine and Coruscant, while visually distinct, both exert a crushing pressure on the individual. On Tatooine, the scarcity of resources and the commodification of human labor force the psyche into a state of hypervigilance, while on Coruscant, the frictionless, high-altitude detachment of the Jedi Temple fosters a different, more insidious form of isolation. Anakin's transition between these poles does not offer him a sense of belonging, but rather shifts his trauma from the physical to the existential. He remains trapped in a repetition compulsion, constantly seeking the approval of authority figures who, by design, cannot provide the unconditional validation required to heal his core wound of abandonment. The Jedi themselves, though ostensibly the protagonists, exist within a state of performative detachment that denies them the ability to integrate their own humanity. Their silence in the face of suffering is not a mark of strength, but a requirement of their professional code, a way of maintaining the illusion of objective authority. By suppressing the somatic reality of their experiences, the physical stress of combat, the burden of loss, they ensure that their emotions remain unexamined, festering in the shadows until they manifest as radical instability. The film argues that this denial of the human element is the fatal flaw of the institution. As the characters navigate the complex political machinations of the Trade Federation and the subtle, seductive influence of the rising Sith, their inability to bridge the gap between their public roles and their private, fractured selves leaves them vulnerable. The tragic irony is that by seeking to eradicate the shadow of the self through rigorous adherence to institutional doctrine, they ensure the eventual emergence of that very shadow, projected outward onto the world they claim to protect. The final victory, such as it is, arrives at a cost that none of the participants are equipped to measure, as they continue to operate within a narrative that treats the destruction of the individual as a necessary, if regrettable, component of the greater good. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The core of the Phantom Menace rests upon the architecture of displacement and the somatic residues of systemic inequality. Anakin Skywalker represents the film's primary vessel for trauma, one rooted in the visceral reality of chattel slavery on Tatooine. His foundational wound, the enforced separation from his mother, is not merely a narrative beat but a structural anchor that dictates his entire psychological trajectory. The film suppresses the true weight of this separation until the final act, shielding the audience from the full implications of the Jedi Council's detachment until the moment the boy's emotional tether is physically severed. By framing his departure from his mother through the lens of a hopeful, heroic transition, the film forces the viewer to reconcile the shiny promise of the Jedi Order with the brutal abandonment of a child's primary attachment figure. This trauma resides within Anakin's body as a form of restless, somatic memory. His physicality is defined by a frantic need for movement and mechanical mastery. He is a child who repairs broken machines as a means to calibrate his own internal stability. In the unforgiving environment of Mos Espa, where labor is synonymous with survival, Anakin treats his body as a tool for constant self-optimization. He pushes his nervous system to the breaking point during the pod race, an activity that serves as his subconscious repetition compulsion. By placing himself in high-velocity, life-threatening scenarios, he attempts to exert agency over an environment that has rendered him an object of trade. His physiological response to stress, a hyper-attuned state of focus, is the only mechanism he possesses to exert control over a world defined by external mandates and restrictive hierarchies. This coping mechanism is fundamentally dissociative. Anakin masks his underlying grief with a projection of unwavering optimism and a desire to be the hero who fixes all things. He adopts the Jedi's own language of restraint, yet his actions repeatedly expose a raw, unrefined emotional output that threatens the sterile tranquility of the Coruscant elite. He exists as a jarring physical presence within the temple, he is the organic, unpredictable variable introduced into a system of rigid, procedural intellectualism. His body acts as a site of constant friction against the Jedi's mandate for non-attachment, as he literally harbors the somatic imprint of the very home and family he is told to forsake. The film highlights this dissonance through the spatial isolation of its characters. Anakin is frequently framed against massive, digital vistas that diminish his singular form, emphasizing his vulnerability. When he stands before the Jedi Council, the wide-angle compositions emphasize the vast, cold geometry of the room, forcing the child into a state of visible discomfort. His movements are erratic and kinetic, contrasting sharply with the sedentary, slow-motion deliberation of the Jedi Masters. This contrast is the film's way of visualizing the incompatibility between his lived experience, marked by the volatility of a slave industrial complex, and the detached, scholastic vacuum of the Republic's protectors. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Anakin's only path toward validation requires the absolute suppression of his somatic history. He is recruited into a life of mental abstraction that demands he trade his bodily autonomy and personal memory for a role in a state-sanctioned metanarrative. The phantom of the title is not merely the return of a forgotten enemy, but the phantom presence of Anakin's own humanity, which he is forced to ghostwrite out of his own life story in real time. His trauma is the silent engine of the film, manifesting as a frantic, high-speed drive toward a destiny he does not choose, but which the system, in its infinite, cold logic, has meticulously prepared for him. The film posits that when a child is conditioned to view their own emotional wounds as liabilities to be transcended, the eventual explosion of that repressed experience becomes an inevitability. Anakin is the physical manifestation of a system's failure to recognize that truth is not something to be learned from a text, but something felt within the fragile, enduring architecture of the human nervous system. The shadow and the antagonist. The psychological architecture of the Phantom Menace rests upon a profound entanglement between the Jedi Order's institutional rigidity and the encroaching emergence of the Sith. At the center of this dynamic, the antagonist, Darth Maul, functions as the physical embodiment of the Jedi's collective repressed shadow. While the Jedi preach a doctrine of detachment and emotional suppression, they effectively externalize the very aggression and instinctual drive they attempt to eradicate from their own consciousness. Maul exists as the silent, kinetic manifestation of this repressed energy, a vessel of pure, focused intent that operates outside the performative decorum of the Galactic Senate. He is not merely a foil for the protagonists, he is the inevitable consequence of a society that demands the total negation of the individual ego for the sake of institutional stability. From an epistemological standpoint, the antagonist's worldview is impeccably logical. The Sith operate on a mandate of clarity and pragmatism, stripping away the ornate, bureaucratic illusions that define the Republic. To the Sith, power is a resource to be seized through the refinement of one's own capabilities, a philosophy that appears entirely rational when viewed against the backdrop of a governing body paralyzed by procedural deadlock and systemic corruption. The villain recognizes that the current power structure is a hollow shell, and his actions represent an empirical rejection of the Jedi's idealistic stagnation. Where the Jedi argue for the preservation of a status quo that has long ceased to function for the benefit of the disenfranchised, the antagonist asserts the necessity of dismantling that structure to pave the way for a more singular, decisive order. This tension is mirrored in the relationship between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn, who serve as the internal catalysts for the film's moral conflict. While both belong to the same institution, they occupy opposite ends of the spectrum regarding adherence to dogma. Qui-Gon represents an intuitive, almost disruptive approach to truth, one that embraces the living experience of the Force, while Obi-Wan represents the institutional pressure to conform to the established, sterile guidelines of the Council. When they encounter Anakin Skywalker, they project their own internal insecurities onto the boy. Qui-Gon projects his desire for redemption and unconventional autonomy, while Obi-Wan projects his anxiety regarding the potential for collapse. They see in Anakin the promise or the peril of their own beliefs, essentially treating him as a vessel for their personal legacy. The shadow and the antagonist. The psychological architecture of the Phantom Menace rests upon a profound entanglement between the Jedi Order's institutional rigidity and the encroaching emergence of the Sith. At the center of this dynamic, the antagonist, Darth Maul, functions as the physical embodiment of the Jedi's collective repressed shadow. While the Jedi preach a doctrine of detachment and emotional suppression, they effectively externalize the very aggression and instinctual drive they attempt to eradicate from their own consciousness. Maul exists as the silent, kinetic manifestation of this repressed energy, a vessel of pure, focused intent that operates outside the performative decorum of the Galactic Senate. He is not merely a foil for the protagonists, he is the inevitable consequence of a society that demands the total negation of the individual ego for the sake of institutional stability. From an epistemological standpoint, the antagonist's worldview is impeccably logical. The Sith operate on a mandate of clarity and pragmatism, stripping away the ornate, bureaucratic illusions that define the Republic, the visual proof of the psyche. Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace functions as a profound meditation on the fragility of identity under the weight of institutional expectation. At its core, the film explores how the human psyche fragments when it is subsumed by rigid, pre-programmed roles, ultimately arguing that the chosen one narrative is not a path to liberation, but a sophisticated mechanism of psychological confinement. The film's brilliance lies in its visual insistence that its characters are not agents of their own destiny, but rather symptoms of a stagnant, dying bureaucracy that demands the total erasure of the individual self in favor of systemic maintenance. The architectural environment of the film acts as the primary antagonist to the human spirit. From the antiseptic, frictionless corridors of the Jedi Council chambers on Coruscant to the cavernous, overwhelming expanse of the Senate Rotunda, the film utilizes expansive digital set extensions to dwarf the individual. Characters like Qui-Gon Jinn and Anakin Skywalker are frequently framed against massive, sterile environments that suggest an ancient, immutable order. This visual isolation serves a specific psychological purpose. It highlights the insignificance of the human soul when placed against the backdrop of a 1,000-year-old state. The Jedi, in particular, exist within a landscape of synthetic light and cold, geometric symmetry, reflecting a philosophy that prioritizes the suppression of personal attachment and emotional spontaneity. They are essentially cogs in a machine, their humanity systematically filtered through a lens of monastic detachment. The character of Anakin Skywalker serves as the film's most poignant study in trauma and the construction of the ego. His transition from a young boy on Tatooine to a candidate for the Jedi Order is not a traditional hero's journey, but a traumatic displacement from a life of tangible connection to a life of abstract, intellectualized service. In the desert, Anakin's reality is grounded in physical labor and the tactile experience of his environment. Once he enters the realm of the Jedi, his identity is rapidly dismantled. The film captures this through subtle shifts in his behavior. He moves from being a child who expresses fear and love to a novice who must perform the role of the obedient disciple. His trauma is stored in his sudden, jarring silence, a somatic response to the loss of his mother and the imposition of a foreign, rigid moral code. He is a person undergoing a forced assimilation into a system that values his potential power far more than his psychological well-being. The film's visual language masterfully depicts this psychological fragmentation through the use of performance. There is a distinct quality to the interactions between characters in power, which often veer toward the uncanny. The Jedi Council members, through their slow, deliberate movements and restrained vocal patterns, appear as manifestations of a collective, institutionalized psyche rather than individual people. This is a deliberate aesthetic choice. By making them appear almost robotic or pre-programmed, the film exposes the hollowness of their wisdom. They operate within a discourse that is entirely severed from the emotional reality of the galaxy. When they discuss the balance of the Force, they do so with a coldness that suggests they have completely abandoned the human element, treating reality as a series of equations to be balanced rather than lives to be lived. The climax of the film serves as the final, devastating proof of this existential entrapment. The battle for Naboo is not a triumph of the individual will, but a series of interconnected, highly coordinated sequences where characters act out their roles with mechanical precision. The death of Qui-Gon Jinn functions as the moment the facade breaks for those left behind. Obi-Wan Kenobi, witnessing his master's end, moves beyond his training, yet he is immediately funneled back into the systemic requirement of the master-apprentice hierarchy. He accepts the burden of the prophecy, inheriting a responsibility that he is ill-equipped to handle, thereby continuing the cycle of psychological repression that the film has meticulously established. The final shot, a grand, triumphant parade on Naboo, is a masterpiece of ironic visual storytelling. While the citizenry celebrates, the protagonists are captured in a state of quiet, somber reflection. Their faces do not mirror the joy of the public, instead, they are frozen in a moment of existential weight. The film makes it clear that the victory over the Trade Federation is a superficial remedy to a deeper, systemic rot. The characters are left trapped within the same institutions that created their pain, destined to repeat the patterns of their predecessors. By refusing to offer a clean, cathartic resolution, the film asserts that true agency is impossible in a world where the structures of power have successfully commodified the very concept of heroism. It leaves the viewer with the unsettling realization that the peace achieved is merely a temporary silence before an inevitable, self-generated collapse. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace functions as a profound meditation on the collapse of epistemological certainty, illustrating a civilization trapped within the limits of its own institutional language. The film posits that the Galactic Republic has become an entity where reality is no longer observed but is instead manufactured through bureaucratic discourse and procedural ritual. Within this framework, truth is not an objective fact to be discovered by the Jedi Order, but a variable mediated by the very administrative bodies the Jedi are sworn to protect. The Senate functions as the ultimate arbiter of truth, yet it is a space where the complexity of communication has outpaced the capacity for meaning, rendering the legislature a theater of performative consensus rather than governance. This linguistic enclosure defines the Jedi's existential struggle. Their failure to perceive the rise of the Sith is rooted in the fact that their vocabulary for evil is limited by the past. By framing the dark side through the lens of history, the Jedi render themselves incapable of recognizing its present-day evolution. They speak a language of ancient prophecy and monastic tradition, which provides no framework for the modern, corporate, and decentralized malice manifested by the Trade Federation and Darth Sidious. The Jedi assume that truth is self-evident to the enlightened, yet the film demonstrates that knowledge is fundamentally tied to the information structures one inhabits. Their inability to see the deception is the logical outcome of a worldview that equates the status quo with the cosmic order, effectively blinding them to the emergence of a new paradigm. The film extends this epistemic fragility to its world-building, particularly through the dichotomy between the sterile, high-tech environments of Coruscant and the tactile, scavenger reality of Tatooine. On Coruscant, the characters navigate a hyper-mediated reality where the truth is presented through holograms and digital interfaces that abstract away the human cost of political maneuvering. The citizenry exists in a post-truth state, submerged in a sea of data where the noise of commerce and bureaucracy drowns out the signals of impending collapse. Conversely, Tatooine represents a brutal, unvarnished encounter with the physical world, where the scarcity of resources enforces a binary, material truth. Yet, even here, Anakin Skywalker's reliance on the mechanics of machinery suggests a mind that understands reality through the assembly and function of parts rather than the abstract discourse of the core worlds. This divide underscores the film's reliance on the Cartesian tension between sensory perception and conceptual understanding. The Jedi believe they can sense the truth through the Force, yet the film introduces the midichlorians, a scientific, biological explanation for their metaphysical power, to anchor their intuition in material reality. This is a deliberate shift toward a more clinical, observable epistemic base, yet it only serves to complicate their moral calculus. By attempting to quantify the intangible, the Jedi inadvertently validate the very materialist, corporate logic that the Sith exploit to consolidate power. The irony is total. In their quest to ground their spiritual authority in a logical, biological fact, the Jedi alienate themselves from the raw, human experience that defines their purpose. Ultimately, the Phantom Menace portrays a society that has lost the ability to distinguish between its internal myths and the external, encroaching reality. The characters are governed by the systems they maintain, operating within a loop of political procedure and archaic prophecy that masks the encroaching shadow. The film presents the tragedy of an establishment so deeply committed to the architecture of its own vocabulary that it cannot process the arrival of a phenomenon that exists outside of its established lexicon. The true danger of the antagonist is not merely a threat of violence, but a fundamental assault on the epistemic foundations of the Republic, proving that when a society's language fails to account for the nature of its own crises, it ensures its own obsolescence. The film stands as a testament to the idea that silence and the inability to articulate shifting threats are the precursors to total systemic dissolution. Metanarratives and social theory. Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace functions as a sophisticated examination of a civilization operating within a hollowed-out grand narrative, where the collapse of institutional legitimacy is masked by the meticulous maintenance of aesthetic order. The film presents the Galactic Republic not as a functional democracy, but as a hyperreal simulation of governance. Within this environment, the Jedi Order acts as the ultimate ideological state apparatus, utilizing a rigid, dogmatic interpretation of the Force to sustain the illusion of cosmic equilibrium. By positioning the Jedi as the architects of this reality, the film reveals how they unknowingly facilitate their own obsolescence. They are keepers of a static history who mistake the repetition of ancient rituals for the active preservation of peace. The tragedy of the Republic is defined by the absolute disconnect between its bureaucratic symbols and its material reality. On the galactic stage, the Senate operates as a theater of noise, where information is processed only to obfuscate truth. The film demonstrates that in this technocratic sprawl, knowledge is a resource controlled by those who curate the metadata of galactic events. When the Trade Federation blockades Naboo, they do so not through an external declaration of war, but by exploiting the legalistic loopholes inherent in the Republic's own architecture. This highlights the vulnerability of a system that has replaced ethical governance with algorithmic proceduralism. The ruling class maintains order through the performative exercise of law, allowing corporate interests to operate with the weight of state authority, thereby proving that the Republic has long since ceded its sovereignty to the capital it purports to regulate. This collapse of the grand narrative is mirrored in the internal lives of its primary agents. The Jedi, tethered to an ascetic code that demands the suppression of emotional memory, become trapped in a self-correcting feedback loop. Their insistence on maintaining the status quo prevents them from recognizing the tectonic shift occurring within the shadow. By attempting to force the young Anakin Skywalker into a predefined mold of chosen one, they treat the individual as a commodity to be integrated into their failing structure. This choice is the film's central moral failure. The Jedi demand the boy surrender to their ideology, effectively ignoring his personal trauma in favor of a prophecy that serves their own institutional survival. The film illustrates that when a governing body becomes obsessed with the preservation of its own history, it becomes blind to the future. The visual language of the film reinforces this sense of a society caught in a terminal, gilded loop. The opulent, sterile architecture of Coruscant serves as a mask for the decay underneath, while the dense, multi-layered environments of Tatooine suggest a reality where the Republic's influence is merely a thin layer of control over a much older, more chaotic truth. Every frame reinforces the disparity between the simulated grace of the elites and the tangible, gritty reality of those left in the periphery. The film's insistence on digital environments and hypersaturated hues creates an uncanny sense of depth, emphasizing that these characters are moving through a space defined by synthetic perfection. It is a world where the signifier has completely detached from the signified. The Jedi robes, the Senate chambers, and the lightsabers themselves are mere props in a play that the audience, and the characters, only realize is over once the curtains are pulled back by the emergence of the Sith. Ultimately, the film serves as a meditation on the failure of institutional inertia. The characters are locked into a trajectory where their attempts to uphold the peace, through mediation, intervention, and the reliance on prophecy, directly precipitate the systemic collapse they fear most. The tragedy is that the protagonists are working within a logic of circular inevitability. They are, quite literally, architects of their own tragedy, operating under the mistaken belief that they're guardians of a civilization that has already ceased to exist in any meaningful capacity. By the time the final act unfolds, the illusion of the Republic's permanence is shattered, revealing that the struggle was never about protecting a stable system, but about realizing that the struggle itself was the only thing preventing them from seeing the inevitable transformation of their world. The film stands as a rigorous critique of the comfort found in dogmatic adherence, demonstrating that when a society chooses to exist within the simulation of its past greatness, it ensures the erasure of its future. Ethics and the moral calculus. The Phantom Menace functions as a profound inquiry into the fragility of a civilization governed by institutionalized moral inertia. At the heart of the narrative lies an uncompromising confrontation with the limits of bureaucratic ethics. The Jedi Order, acting as the primary moral arbiters, operates within a framework of strict deontology, where adherence to ancient codes and procedural neutrality dictates their reality. Their failure, and the subsequent emergence of the Sith, is a direct consequence of a moral calculus that prioritizes the preservation of the status quo over the active pursuit of justice. By clinging to the rigid preservation of existing structures, the Jedi transform into an entity that serves the order of the galaxy rather than its actual people, inadvertently creating the vacuum in which Palpatine's utilitarian manipulation can flourish. This tension between rigid moral systems and the chaotic reality of lived experience is best exemplified in the film's treatment of Anakin Skywalker. The Jedi Council's hesitation to train him stems from a fear-based assessment of his potential for suffering, yet their refusal to offer him guidance constitutes a moral error. They perceive his attachment to his mother as a liability that threatens the sanctity of their detachment, thereby choosing to abandon a sentient individual to satisfy the requirements of their doctrine. In this context, the film posits that true moral agency requires the courage to move beyond the safety of codified behavior. The Jedi's failure to embrace Anakin is the primary catalyst for the galaxy's descent, suggesting that when an ideology is decoupled from the capacity for empathy, it ceases to be a force for good and becomes a mere instrument of bureaucratic entropy. The film extends this critique of moral systems to the planetary conflict on Naboo. The trade blockade by the Federation serves as a raw display of corporate utilitarianism, where the ends of profit and geopolitical dominance justify the means of starvation and technological subjugation. The Federation views the Gungans and the human population as variables in a calculation of resource extraction. When the protagonists act to liberate the planet, they find themselves locked in a conflict where the distinction between their violence and that of their enemies is defined entirely by their internal motivation. Their choice to forge a treaty with the Gungans represents an existential pivot. By choosing to bridge the divide between two disparate, distrustful cultures, the characters construct their own meaning within a universe that initially provides none. They reject the nihilism inherent in the Federation's cold, transactional worldview by prioritizing communal solidarity over the preservation of an established power hierarchy. Furthermore, the character of Qui-Gon Jinn emerges as an anomaly within the Jedi Order, representing an active form of moral intuition that challenges the status quo. He understands that the universe is not a sterile map of predictable outcomes but a living, breathing entity governed by the Force. His decision to pursue the truth regarding the Sith, even when the Council demands passive observation, asserts the necessity of individual responsibility in the face of systemic corruption. Qui-Gon recognizes that staying comfortably unaware is a moral surrender. His pursuit of knowledge, regardless of the consequences for his own standing or the safety of the status quo, illustrates an adherence to a higher, personal ethics that transcends the institutional limitations of his peers. The film ultimately argues that the moral collapse of a society begins when its leaders prioritize the integrity of the system over the humanity of the individuals within it. Palpatine thrives because he understands that a society addicted to the illusion of order will eventually sacrifice its values to preserve that illusion at any cost. The Jedi, blinded by their own adherence to traditional structures, fail to see that their very commitment to stability is the anchor pulling them into the abyss. By examining these dynamics, the Phantom Menace frames the struggle for the galaxy as a constant, necessary rebellion against the temptation to let structures do our thinking for us. The tragic trajectory of the saga is not an inevitability of nature, but a result of a series of conscious, ethical failures. The film posits that light is not an inherent state of the universe, but an active, exhausting labor of moral construction that must be performed by the individual, often in defiance of the very authorities who claim to be its defenders. In this light, the film remains a chilling meditation on the fragility of institutions that have forgotten the purpose behind their own rules, leaving them hollow shells awaiting the inevitable rise of a more pragmatic, and more dangerous, force. Determinism, agency, and time. Star Wars, Episode I, The Phantom Menace functions as a rigorous examination of the tension between individual agency and the crushing weight of predetermined historical cycles. While the surface narrative presents a straightforward conflict between political factions and the burgeoning threat of the Sith, the film operates on a deeper level as a meditation on the illusion of choice within a rigid, deterministic galaxy. The central figures are not autonomous actors but are instead conduits for a massive, unfolding structural necessity, where their every decision, no matter how seemingly spontaneous, serves to advance a trajectory that has been set in motion long before their arrival. The Jedi Order, as the primary architects and maintainers of the galactic status quo, exemplifies this deterministic framework. they view the Force not as a tool for personal empowerment, but as a teleological current that dictates the flow of events. By tethering their moral code to the prophecy of the Chosen One, the Jedi institutionalize a belief system that effectively erodes personal agency. Anakin Skywalker's introduction is the film's most potent critique of this determinism. He is identified by his midichlorian count, a biological quantification of his destiny, which transforms his existence into a mathematical inevitability rather than a journey of self-discovery. His liberation from slavery on Tatooine is not an escape into freedom, but a relocation into a more sophisticated structural mechanism. He merely trades the explicit control of Watto for the implicit, ideological control of the Jedi Council. The film illustrates that when one's future is declared as a cosmic certainty, the present loses its capacity for authentic choice. This structure extends to the political arena, where the collapse of the Galactic Republic appears preordained. The Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo serves as the catalyst, but the film portrays this as a necessary symptom of a system that has become too stagnant to sustain itself. Chancellor Valorum's inability to act is not a failure of character, but the logical endpoint of a bureaucracy so entrenched in procedure that it has lost the ability to navigate reality. Palpatine, conversely, acts as the personification of the system's self-correcting mechanisms. He does not create the chaos, he maneuvers within the existing cracks of the democratic process to accelerate the inevitable. His rise to power is portrayed as the logical, almost mathematical consequence of a society that has surrendered its governance to the comfort of institutional decay. The film's visual language reinforces this sense of inevitability. The architecture of Coruscant, with its sprawling, endless layers of cityscape, renders the individual insignificant, swallowed by the sheer scale of the historical machine. The characters are frequently framed in expansive, static environments that dwarf their movements, emphasizing their roles as small gears within an immense, self-perpetuating apparatus. Even the action sequences, dazzling in their technical choreography, serve to emphasize the relentless momentum of the plot. The multi-tiered duel between the Jedi and Darth Maul is not merely a physical confrontation but a symbolic collision of opposing temporal forces, where the precision of the combatants reflects a rigorous adherence to the roles they have been assigned by their respective doctrines. Ultimately, the Phantom Menace presents a universe where the struggle for meaning is a lonely endeavor against a backdrop of crushing structuralism. The characters are trapped in a loop where their attempts to maintain the light or conquer the dark only serve to satisfy the historical cycle. Qui-Gon Jinn is the only figure who demonstrates a resistance to this determinism, insisting on his own intuition against the dogma of the Council, yet his demise confirms the system's refusal to allow for individual deviation. By the film's conclusion, the transition of power and the initiation of Anakin's training are presented not as triumphs of will, but as the final closing of a circuit. The film settles on a chilling synthesis: the universe moves toward its own destruction with a cold, mathematical efficiency, and the individuals caught in its wake are defined not by their freedom to choose, but by their participation in the cycle that will ultimately consume them. This existential weight lends the film its unique gravity, suggesting that the most tragic limitation on human agency is the certainty of one's own role in a history already written. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and spatial language. The visual language of the Phantom Menace functions as a grand orchestration of spatial dominance and sensory artifice. By employing a rigid architectural hierarchy, the film communicates the stasis of its political institutions. The Jedi Council chamber, for instance, is a masterclass in circular framing. By placing the masters on an elevated perimeter, the cinematography forces the viewer to perceive them as a centralized, detached authority. The circular geometry creates an illusion of infinite reach while simultaneously trapping the characters within a closed loop of deliberation. When individuals enter this space, they are consistently shot from low, reverent angles that emphasize the hierarchy of the system, cementing the Jedi as pillars of a structured, immutable reality. Camera movement throughout the film operates with the precision of an objective, omnipresent observer. Eschewing the erratic, handheld aesthetics of more intimate character studies, the camera in the Phantom Menace moves with a smooth, systematic grace, often utilizing sweeping dolly and crane shots to navigate the sprawling environments of Naboo and Coruscant. This stylistic choice mirrors the film's preoccupation with the grand flow of history and the mechanics of government. The camera acts as a sentient witness to the gears of diplomacy, gliding through frictionless transit spaces and vast, sterile halls. This robotic fluidity suggests a world where events are governed by complex, often impersonal forces that operate independently of the individuals caught within them. The film's color palette functions as a narrative shorthand, demarcating the boundary between the natural and the synthetic. Naboo is rendered in a saturated, vibrant spectrum of emeralds, golds, and floral hues, emphasizing a world of organic warmth and tactile reality. In direct contrast, the urban expanse of Coruscant relies on a palette of steel blues, charcoal grays, and artificial, neon-inflected lighting. As characters traverse these spaces, the color temperature shifts to reflect their internal alignment. When the protagonists move from the sun-drenched, textured landscapes of Tatooine to the cool, ethereal lighting of the Jedi Temple, the visual shift mirrors a transition from the chaotic reality of the frontier to the calculated, intellectualized seclusion of the capital. Depth and negative space are leveraged to highlight the isolation inherent in high-stakes positions of power. Characters are often positioned within massive, empty frames that underscore their insignificance against the scale of their responsibilities. Padma Amidala, for instance, is frequently framed against the vast, towering architecture of the Theed Palace or the Senate, where the sheer volume of negative space around her form serves as a visual metaphor for the weight of her political isolation. These compositions trap the characters in a state of existential prominence. They are clearly defined by their surroundings yet dwarfed by the institutional scale of the world they inhabit. The motif of light serves as the ultimate arbiter of truth and deception within the film's reality. Natural light is used to expose the clarity of intention, particularly in moments of genuine connection, while synthetic, diffused, or heavily managed light sources are used to create an artificial dreamscape that conceals the rot within the Senate and the shifting allegiances of the political elite. When scenes take place in the dark, high-contrast interiors, the lighting is often used to emphasize the duality of characters like Palpatine, with one side of the face obscured to suggest the hidden machinations beneath the surface. This play of light is not merely atmospheric, it is an active participant in the film's epistemological structure, reinforcing the idea that in a world of high-level diplomacy, light is a tool used to curate perception rather than reveal the raw, unvarnished nature of the truth. Through this meticulous technical execution, the film establishes a reality that feels both grand in scale and claustrophobically ordered, perfectly aligning its visual craft with the narrative weight of a civilization drifting toward its own structural collapse. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The Phantom Menace functions as a pioneering architecture of the digital sublime, representing an ambitious, totalizing commitment to the synthetic environment. Rather than attempting to hide the artifice, the film establishes a visual logic where digital and practical elements exist in a state of continuous, high-fidelity synthesis. The integration of synthetic assets, ranging from the sprawling, multi-layered vistas of Naboo's capital to the densely populated arena stands of Mos Espa, relies on a meticulous alignment of lighting, temperature and edge definition that anchors disparate elements within a unified color space. This spatial consistency transforms the screen into a digital canvas where the boundaries between the captured performance and the generated surroundings are intentionally dissolved to support a broader, more operatic sense of scale. The physics of these digital spaces are governed by a distinct gravitational weight that emphasizes the kinetic reality of the world. Objects and vehicles within the film, such as the pods in the Boonta Eve Classic, demonstrate a calculated adherence to inertia and mass, providing a tactile texture that anchors the frantic, high-speed choreography. When digital craft collides with solid environments, the resultant impact generates a sensory feedback loop that reinforces the substantiality of the world building, suggesting that the digital medium is not merely a shorthand for speed, but a tool for crafting complex, lived-in environments. The digital environments are heavily layered, utilizing intricate texturing and global illumination to ensure that the environment feels occupied and weathered, effectively masking the clinical nature of computer-generated space. The film pushes into the territory of the uncanny by populating its synthetic world with digital beings whose movements and ocular behavior are designed to bridge the gap between caricature and presence. By focusing on the micro-movements of characters like Jar Jar Binks and Sebulba, the film navigates the complexities of personality projection through digital anatomy. The vitality in these characters originates in the rhythm of their saccadic movements and the reactive glint captured in their eyes, which allows them to participate in interpersonal scenes as equal performers rather than mere visual flourishes. This commitment to maintaining a baseline of human-like behavioral cues, even within non-human physiology, allows the audience to map internal psychological states onto characters that exist entirely within the digital realm. A vast portion of the film's visual stability is derived from the seamless application of invisible VFX. Sophisticated set extensions and procedural crowd multiplication function as the architectural bedrock of the film, providing a sense of depth and peripheral density that makes the locations feel expansive and lived in. These quiet effects are fundamental to the film's aesthetic, as they establish the background reality that allows the primary action to thrive. By utilizing digital layers to fill the negative space of the frame, the film constructs an environment that feels perpetually active and interconnected, reinforcing the sociological weight of the galactic system. The economic aesthetic of the film is defined by a dense, maximalist approach to production design. The visual density, characterized by complex, multilayered textures and a saturation of detail, serves to elevate the tone of the film, suggesting a grand, historical scope that transcends the limitations of traditional, localized set design. This commitment to global illumination and rich, varied color palettes ensures that even the most complex digital sequences feel grounded within the film's established reality. By investing in a high-density, multi-layered visual language, the film achieves a cohesive tone that suggests an entire civilization, rather than a mere set of isolated locations. The technological craft within the film acts as an essential component of the storytelling, creating a synthetic reality that is as immersive and coherent as the physics governing the actors themselves. In this synthesis of digital and practical, the film successfully establishes a framework where the synthetic environment functions as a character unto itself, providing the scale and complexity required for the grand narrative unfolding within it. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The Phantom Menace functions as a masterclass in sensory density, utilizing audio, rhythm, and visual artifice to construct a reality that feels both expansive and fundamentally detached from human grounding. The soundscape operates as the primary architect of the film's atmosphere, where the distinction between diegetic sound and musical score is deliberately porous. John Williams' orchestral compositions frequently bleed into the mechanical textures of the environment, weaving thematic leitmotifs into the hum of hyperdrives, the crackle of energy shields, and the rhythmic percussion of droid marches. This integration suggests a universe where the metaphysical, represented by the Force, is inextricably woven into the technological, asserting that the machinery of the galaxy possesses a literal, rhythmic pulse. By tethering the musical identity of the characters to the ambient noise of their surroundings, the film reinforces the idea that these individuals are products of their technological infrastructure, vibrating in sync with the systems they inhabit. The sonic environment is characterized by an overwhelming, layered complexity that mirrors the protagonist's shifting mental state. In the claustrophobic corridors of Naboo or the vast, echoing chambers of the Senate, the sound mix is calibrated to isolate characters within their respective roles. When Keegan Jin or Padme Amidala retreat into states of high-level deliberation, the ambient noise of the galaxy, the whir of floating transport platforms and the distant cacophony of Coruscant is subtly dampened, shifting the viewer's perspective inward. This manipulation of audio perspective creates a vacuum around the characters, signaling moments where they are untethered from their environment and fully subsumed by the weight of their political and spiritual burdens. The editing rhythm follows a precise, almost mathematical cadence that emphasizes the structured, ritualistic nature of the film's reality. During sequences of high-stakes political maneuvering, the cut speed remains steady and deliberate, reflecting the cold, bureaucratic pace of the Republic. Conversely, during the film's kinetic set pieces, such as the pod race or the final multi-fronted battle, the rhythm accelerates, utilizing rapid, rhythmic cutting to mirror the fracturing of the character's composure. These shifts in pacing mimic the destabilization of the film's established order, as the sleek, pre-programmed life of the Jedi and the Senate is violently interrupted by the encroaching chaos of the Sith. The editing ensures that the viewer experiences this loss of control not as a narrative beat, but as a visceral, rhythmic shift in the film's internal tempo. Silence is deployed with surgical precision, serving as a weapon to punctuate the film's pivotal philosophical revelations. Throughout the film, the dense soundscape is occasionally stripped away entirely during moments of quiet intensity, such as the final confrontation with Darth Maul or the silent, agonizing realizations regarding the nature of the prophecy. By plunging the audience into a sudden, Absolute silence, the film highlights the vacuum left by the failing institutions of the Republic. This silence forces the viewer to confront the isolation of the individual standing against a systemic collapse. It is in these quiet voids that the film's technical illusion is most effective. The absence of sound forces the audience to project their own internal anxiety onto the frame, making the philosophical weight of the moment feel personal and unavoidable. The craft of the sound design, coupled with the rhythmic discipline of the editing, transforms the film into an immersive, self-correcting machine that meticulously documents the precise moment a golden age begins to dissolve into shadow. Synthesis of craft. The Phantom Menace functions as a rigorous exercise in technical maximalism, where the boundaries between practical set design and digital artifice are intentionally erased. George Lucas utilizes this synthesis of craft not merely as a spectacle, but as a deliberate narrative tool to map the transition from a stable, established order into an era of profound institutional fragmentation. The film's visual language is characterized by an expansive use of high-resolution digital environments that physically mirror the bureaucratic scale of the Republic, effectively dwarfing the individual participants within the frame. Through the deployment of wide-angle lenses, the film creates a sense of infinite, often sterile, horizontal depth in locations like the Coruscant cityscape or the Naboo royal chambers. This choice emphasizes the vast, impersonal reach of the galaxy's power structures, where characters are frequently positioned as singular, isolated points within a sprawling, meticulously rendered architecture. The texture of the medium reflects a pivotal shift in the history of filmmaking, as the production embraces the clean, sharp fidelity of digital cinematography while retaining the warm, tactile color palettes of traditional celluloid. This hybridization serves to bridge the gap between the familiar, organic textures of the characters, who are often framed against practical, weathered environments like Tatooine, and the cold, synthetic perfection of the Republic's technological gatekeepers. By processing the digital imagery to mimic the grain and subtle halation of film, the production grounds its speculative, high-tech reality in a visual history that feels earned and lived in. This aesthetic consistency is crucial, as it allows the viewer to accept the presence of purely computer-generated entities, such as Jar Jar Binks or the droids, as organic extensions of the same physical universe. The physics applied to these digital assets prioritize weight and displacement, ensuring that every movement within the frame asserts a tangible presence that anchors the audience in the film's internal logic. Lighting serves as the primary mechanism for delineating the moral architecture of the narrative. The cinematography employs a sophisticated use of chiaroscuro, particularly in sequences involving the Sith or the subterranean chambers of Naboo, to externalize the internal division of the characters. These shadows do not merely provide atmospheric tension, they function as visual manifestations of the Jungian shadow, illustrating the creeping presence of suppressed corruption within a seemingly enlightened civilization. In the final confrontation between Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Darth Maul, the lighting design transitions from the expansive, balanced illumination of the hangar to a rhythmic, pulsing interplay of laser fire and containment fields. This choreography of light serves to isolate the combatants within a closed system, turning their physical conflict into a literal expression of the philosophical battle between order and entropy. The technical execution reaches its peak in the film's ability to use the frame as a container for overwhelming, layered information. The camera acts as a disciplined, objective witness, utilizing smooth, deliberate movements that navigate complex, synthetic spaces with a precision that replaces the frantic, cut-heavy editing typical of contemporary action. By opting for longer, sustained shots during moments of high stakes, the director forces the audience to confront the scale of the environment as a dominant participant in the story. This choice underscores the inevitability of the political collapse occurring on the periphery. The characters are trapped by the very systems they occupy, and the camera's refusal to cut away from these cavernous digital vistas emphasizes their inability to escape the momentum of the unfolding tragedy. Ultimately, the most technically impressive shots in the Phantom Menace, such as the sweeping transitions between the underwater cities and the orbital blockade, are deeply aligned with the film's central philosophical inquiry. They demonstrate that in a world defined by the hyperconnectivity of information and trade, the individual is increasingly becoming a ghost within the machinery of the state. The craftsmanship is not a veil for a lack of substance, it is the substance itself. By creating a world that is visually indistinguishable from its own propaganda, the film forces the viewer to recognize that the corruption of the Republic is visible in every pixel of its architecture, every layer of its digital expansion, and every shadow cast upon its gilded surfaces. The technical synthesis acts as the final evidence that the civilization being depicted has reached the absolute limit of its own sustainability, proving that when reality is fully synthesized, truth becomes the only casualty. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. The Phantom Menace functions as a sophisticated examination of institutional calcification and the inevitable migration of power from the ideological to the transactional. At the center of this narrative lies the Jedi Order, an organization whose collapse is rendered not through sudden violence, but through a slow, imperceptible erosion of its own epistemic authority. By presenting a galaxy that has traded the organic risks of growth for the sterile predictability of bureaucracy, the film articulates a reality where the Jedi act as the ultimate keepers of a status quo that has already outlived its moral mandate. This is a story about the fragility of peace when that peace is maintained by an aging, insular elite who have lost the ability to perceive the very shadow they cast. The world building establishes a hierarchy defined by the centralization of capital and the commodification of movement. From the subterranean, refuse-choked streets of Coruscant to the frictionless, high-altitude spires of the Senate, the architecture serves as a visceral map of social stratification. The reliance on digital environments, wide, sprawling cityscapes and complex, procedural interiors, creates a deliberate aesthetic of scale that diminishes the individual. Within this frame, human experience is mediated by technological gatekeeping and corporate blockade, reducing geopolitical conflict to a matter of trade routes and taxation. The Jedi represent a vestigial aristocracy, their existence sanctioned by a republic that treats them as a diplomatic tool rather than a spiritual vanguard. Central to this psychological collapse is the character of Anakin Skywalker, a figure whose foundational trauma is not merely the loss of his childhood, but his integration into a system that views his innate potential as a variable to be managed. The film depicts the Jedi Council's refusal to train him as a profound act of bureaucratic cowardice. They fear the disruption he represents to their fragile, pre-programmed order. Anakin's journey is thus a tragedy of stifled agency. His internal struggle, caught between the suffocating dogma of the Jedi and the burgeoning realization of his own power, is mirrored by the visual isolation imposed upon him by the vast, artificial landscapes of the core worlds. He is a boy seeking connection in a society that only values his potential utility as a commodity. The film's philosophical weight rests on the failure of the Jedi to reconcile their moral absolutism with an increasingly fluid, post-truth landscape. The Sith antagonist, Darth Maul, operates with a predatory precision that exposes the Jedi's intellectual atrophy. Where the Jedi cling to a rigid, decaying grand narrative, the Sith represent the rise of a new, purely pragmatic ideology. The conflict is not merely physical, it is an epistemological struggle over the nature of reality. The Jedi are blinded by their own ideological state apparatus, convinced that they are the sole arbiters of truth, while the true catalyst for the collapse moves silently through the shadows of the political machine. Technically, the film serves as a pivotal bridge between the physical and the digital, utilizing groundbreaking VFX to construct a world that feels both expansive and eerily synthetic. This digital artifice is not a flaw but a thematic necessity. It underscores the detachment of the film's ruling class from the physical reality of the citizens they govern. The rhythmic editing during sequences like the Boonta Eve classic and the final lightsaber duel punctuates the shift from the cerebral, silent politics of the Senate to the frantic, visceral urgency of the coming systemic collapse. The sound design, layered with discordant echoes of a golden age now fading, emphasizes the underlying tension of a civilization standing on the precipice of its own obsolescence. The legacy of the Phantom Menace lies in its portrayal of a system that guarantees its own destruction through its inability to confront the phantom of its own history. The final image of the film, the joyous, hollow celebration of the Gungans and the Naboo, serves as a devastating irony. It is a moment of false catharsis that masks the true trajectory of the galaxy. By framing this victory against the silent, looming presence of the Chancellor, the film leaves the audience with the understanding that the institutional rot has already reached the heart of the Republic. The struggle was never about winning the battle on Naboo, it was about the subtle, irreversible surrender of the individual to a system that, in its pursuit of order, has traded away its soul. This is a definitive study of how the erosion of truth, coupled with the hubris of the gatekeepers, transforms a thriving society into a silent accomplice in its own demise.